everybody, and thanks for joining us for today's on-demand session on body-worn cameras and Canadian policing. I am honored to be joined by Dr. Alana Saulnier. She's going to provide a brief history of police use of body-worn cameras in history, and then we're going to discuss some real cutting-edge new research on this technology. Alana has a PhD and degrees in sociology and criminology. She is currently an assistant professor and the criminology program coordinator at Lakehead University. In addition to body-worn camera research, she has published on the topics of legal authorities, use of surveillance technologies, and restorative justice programs. Alana, thank you so much for joining us today.
Wonderful to be here, Renee. Thank you.
So you've been involved in body-worn camera research for a while now. Tell me more about how this all started for you. Why body-worn cameras?
Yeah, so you mentioned that I did some work or do some work in the area of restorative justice, and that was the very first thing I started my research with as a master's student, and it kicked off this interest in me in the relationships between legal authorities and the public, and really thinking about how do we get the most out of those interactions. And in a more narrowed sense in relation to police, how do we enforce laws in a way that the public finds most acceptable and most satisfying, which really enhances the ability of the police to be able to do their job well. Cooperation with the public is essential. And something that I focused on as I entered and moved into my PhD and beyond was the extent to which technology is something that could prove very important in that regard. Interactions with legal authorities, police as an example, are increasingly being mediated through technology, a case in point being body-worn cameras, but we also see them even automated in many senses, automated license plate recognition, for example, smart CCTV. And so that's the kind of trajectory I took to get to this topic. When I finished my PhD, I went and worked at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And it was there that I had the opportunity to first work with police in an applied capacity. There were excellent scholars there, Dennis Rosenbaum and William McCarty, who had an existing relationship with the Chicago Police Department and were evaluating the CPD's body-worn cameras pilot project for them. And they offered me the opportunity to join that. And that was the point that I realized this is the type of research that matters the most to me. I want to work with police, partner with them to be able to work on advancing the state of policing in Canada particularly. So doing that, I think, is something that really brings researchers with a specialization in something like evaluation, so identifying causal relationships, what's the effects of doing something different, with practitioners in the interest of making policing increasingly evidence-based. After that, I joined Lakehead in 2018, got to come back to Canada. It was perfectly timed to be able to partner with an excellent local police service to me, the Durham Regional Police Service. And that was my opportunity to lead a body-worn camera evaluation. And that was, just solidified the extent to which I really enjoy partnering with police and want to focus on the technologies that they're using to do their work.
Wonderful. I couldn't agree more. Here at Blue Line, we like to say we want to provide, tools to help officers, the front line of all ranks, really just do their jobs better and more efficiently. So we're on the same page there.
Yeah.
Well, what do we know about the frequency of police use of body-worn cameras internationally and here in Canada?
So we certainly know that there's been a dramatic increase in their popularity, which at this moment, it's kind of funny. Renee and I set this call up before we really saw body-worn cameras take off in the past week or so again, but they're becoming a really big deal. So our earliest documented trials, I'd say, date back to 2005 in the UK. Shortly after that, both the United States and Canada start getting their first case of body-worn cameras. Victoria Police Service in Canada was the first, to my knowledge, to pilot body-worn cameras and produce an evaluation in 2009. Now, you see somewhat of a slow start. You think, oh, why didn't body-worn cameras pick up right away? There is clear practitioner interest in the technology. We can see it dating back, over a decade. but it's an expensive technology. It was an even more expensive technology when we're thinking just a few years ago, let alone that far ago. Then we have something really important happen, and it's sort of a watershed moment. I'd say that many scholars who look at this topic recognize it as 2014. We see a number of very controversial, high-profile, police-involved deaths in the United States, and it sparks substantial unrest, which produces a public demand for body-worn cameras. That's a really important change when the public starts demanding something from police. All of a sudden, there's not just an internal interest in a technology, there's public pressure. And then we have other really important thing that happened in the United States, and that's that the government pledges a very large amount of money to equip services with body-worn cameras during that whole aftermath of 2014. And these sort of government funding schemes massively pick up the adoption pace of technologies. Body-worn cameras are a case in point that we can see in the United States with the massive uptake of cameras there. So as of 2018, it was estimated that more than half of the 18,000 US services were working with body-worn cameras, and we know that number has grown since then. But we also know in the past that there's other sort of examples of this. CCTV is a good one in the UK, that government funding schemes in the early 90s really massively expanded the use of CCTV there. Now, coming back to body-worn cameras, US policing has an influence on the global policing standards. They do set a bit of a benchmark, I would say. Now, Canada, in this same time period, 2014, early 2010s, is really starting to have some services think about body-worn cameras, but overall the interest is a bit more slowed. So I actually conducted a national survey last year with services, so reaching out to 143 services. In total, 127 responded to me, and of those, 17, so roughly 12%, had actually trialed body-worn cameras in some way, but a further 35, so an additional 24%, was in some stage of formally considering trialing body-worn cameras. So overall, we've got roughly 36% of Canadian services that have at least considered body-worn camera adoption, but then that's kind of all changed now. That number, we know, is climbing at this very moment. And the fact that body-worn cameras seem really likely to figure prominently into the future of policing, of Canadian policing, means that we really want to start to build evidence that guides their adoption.
Wonderful. I couldn't agree more, and I'm curious to really see what the next few months will bring in terms of some widespread adoption that we're hearing could happen. So
Yeah.
stay tuned, I guess, right?
Yes.
So increasingly, as you mentioned, people are expecting the policing to be evidence-based. So what does that mean, and what sort of evidence is building in relation to police use of body-worn cameras?
The concept of evidence-based policing is really very simple, and it's probably one that all practitioners, all members of the public can really get behind. It's the idea that we should very intentionally be using research to guide decisions, policies, practices in policing. So that means that we have to let go of doing something because that's the way it's always been done. We can't assume that's the most effective or efficient way to do something. And it also means that when we start a new initiative, like body-worn cameras, that we build it on a solid foundation. And that means building a body of research. Now, implementing body-worn cameras, or really any change in policing, in a way that allows us to understand it, means tracking its effects. So when we make a change to policing, we want to be able to know, well, what effect does this change have? What happens when we do this versus that? And so when we think about body-worn cameras, there's certainly all sorts of effects that we might be interested in exploring. How does it affect public perceptions of police? How does it affect the way officers do their work? How does it affect court outcomes? Now, the evidence base around body-worn cameras is growing. always research lags behind. Research is a slow production process, but I would say that this is probably a topic around which policing scholars and policing practitioners have had the most successful collaboration in the history of policing. We've seen a lot of research that's high quality emerge in a short period of time. So what do we know when I'm synthesizing that area of research? One thing I can tell you is the public is highly supportive of body-worn cameras. That is something, it's just an opinion piece, it's opinion data. Well, it's a very important piece of information in my opinion, especially when you come back to what I'm interested in, relationships between legal authorities and the public. Relationships are founded on opinions. If the public wants something from police, to what extent do police leaders really have an obligation to meet that expectation? So we know the public's highly supportive of cameras. That needs to be something that factors into this decision-making process. Now, a much less tested question when we're thinking about body-worn cameras in the public is, to what extent does police use of the cameras actually improve public perceptions of police, these topics of accountability, transparency, trust? There are very few studies that have done research, or there are very few empirical tests of that question. One was done here in Canada by myself with the Durham Regional Police Service. I would say of the very few number of studies, and a few in the States, one in Turkey, ours in Canada, that what the evidence suggests on that front is that body-worn cameras are capable of improving public perceptions of interactions with police, but that those effects aren't particularly dramatic. And what I mean is that we're talking about small improvements here, that I go from having a reasonably good experience to a slightly better experience. So we're not talking about something that's raising people from having terrible experiences to really positive ones in the research that's been done, but that's also in the context of studies that are in places where the attitudes are already fairly favorable. So research that looks into effects in communities where community police relations are more strained is needed and could reveal something that maybe is a little bit more interesting. Now, when we think about the improvements we do see, I still say it's great to see improvements in public perceptions of police. But why do we see those improvements? Why do we see people be a little bit happier with their interaction, feel that it was more satisfying, these sorts of things? There's lots of explanations, and we're not quite sure what the answer is yet. One is that, officer behavior improves, and therefore the public feels better about it. Another is that the community members' behavior improves, and as a result, the officer responds more positively. The whole interaction is more successful. Another one that I think is worth considering when we think about the fact that the community has demonstrated a lot of support for this technology, there could be some simple symbolic value to wearing it, that I see this camera and I feel better about the interaction despite anything else needing to change. We don't know the answer to that, and research is still going to be valuable to help us understand what we call causal mechanisms. What are the things that actually make this effect happen, that the use of a body-worn camera improves attitudes? Slightly, as I said. Now, other areas of important research, things we know, officer perception studies, there's been some quite consistent results there. Officers tend to be initially uncertain to supportive of body-worn cameras. So that's a sort of spectrum we see officers falling on before they've used the tech. But research demonstrates that after officers use the technology, they tend to feel much more positive about it. And that is because they come to identify it as serving them in various ways. So we see officers talk about things like feeling protected from frivolous complaints, and that it is able to function as an effective policing tool, particularly in relation to the idea of evidence gathering. Now, another effect with some consistency that's been demonstrated is that officers wearing body-worn cameras receive fewer complaints than officers not wearing body-worn cameras. Now we've got quite a few studies that deal with that question. Some find effects and some don't. But I'd say that we do see a sort of leaning towards the fact that there is a reduction in complaints. Now, again, the explanations here aren't incredibly straightforward. There's at least two that are very clear. complaints might be reduced because officer behavior genuinely improves, not needing to generate complaints. But in others, of course, that complaints might be reduced because malicious complaints, frivolous complaints are less prevalent. Now, I do just want to note, thinking about our Canadian research that's been produced, that the studies that have looked at that in Canada have not found that body-worn cameras had any effect on complaints against officers. So something important to know in the Canadian context. There's some research questions that have much less consistency in terms of what we know. The results are much more mixed. Use of force is a good case in point on that front. So there's been very mixed results across the research when it comes to whether body-worn cameras diminish police use of force. Some studies show that it does, others demonstrate that it doesn't. And, you know, it's hard again to say exactly why that is the case. I would say that use of force is an especially challenging outcome to assess successfully because of the way that use of force is recorded, the way we define it, what actually constitutes a use of force incident. It's all a bit of a murky area for a researcher to be able to get a good handle of. So challenging topic there. Now, another really important topic that hasn't received very much attention is what effect do body-worn cameras have on court outcomes? There hasn't been a whole lot of research on this topic. So we've got a handful of studies out of the United States. And on the more optimistic end, I'd say that existing research demonstrates that body-worn cameras have some small positive effects on court outcomes. And by that, I mean that they're producing more pro-prosecution outcomes, but not dramatically. And then if I was to look at that on the more pessimistic end of interpreting the existing research, we'd see that body-worn cameras don't seem to have much of an impact on court outcomes. It's not negative, but it's not doing anything positive. Now, part of the evaluation I did with Durham involved looking at court outcomes, both for Provincial Offences Act and criminal court outcomes. And we do see some evidence in that study that body-worn cameras increase pro-prosecution outcomes, as well as reducing timelines to resolution. But we are talking about small effects here. So again, it's not something that's particularly dramatic that would make you think, oh, this is the reason we will adopt cameras. Now, I'm sure that anybody listening to this might be thinking, well, that's ridiculous. Surely body-worn cameras will have an impact on court outcomes. It's evidence. But in fact, you have to remember that a lot of body-worn camera recordings are really not evidence. They are a recording of an officer doing their job. And as long as that officer has done their job in a way that's procedurally correct, that body-worn camera footage isn't very relevant to this court case that's going to be moving through. Now, that is an issue. It's a topic that we have essentially no research on. What percentage of body-worn camera footage is typically of evidentiary value? What is the effect of just that isolated evidentiary footage on court outcomes? Certainly could be perceived to be much higher than the small effects we see when we lump in all that non-evidentiary footage as well. Those are really important questions that we need research to answer. Now, and I'm so sorry to keep going, there's just so much research here. There's a very important need for research on the effects of body-worn cameras on service outputs and officer workload. Again, that study I conducted with DRPS, it demonstrated that body-worn cameras didn't produce negative impacts on these sort of outcomes. So I'm talking about things here like the time it takes to deal with calls for service generally, that wasn't increased in a way that was significant. So it wasn't greater in the body-worn camera condition compared to the non-body-worn camera condition, which really means when body-worn cameras were used compared to when they weren't, it wasn't affecting how long it took officers on average to complete calls for service. We also didn't see officers being any more likely to issue tickets or to issue charges when they used body-worn cameras compared to not. And even if they did issue a ticket or charge, that they weren't that group of officers wearing cameras wasn't more likely to issue a greater number, which all of that is kind of interesting and important to this idea of discretion, which officers have concerns about, justifiable concerns, but we've got some evidence there suggesting that officers are still effectively exercising discretion. Now, all of that together, let me sum that up, is that there's definitely important work that's been done. It gives us some understandings of what we can anticipate from body-worn cameras, but we still have certainly a lot more to do to build an evidence base in terms of understanding the effects of body-worn cameras, especially in Canada, where we're talking about very few studies informing our understanding of this in the Canadian context.
Wow, yeah, thank you for all of that. It was fantastic, and I loved how you pointed out there's still questions to be asked, and yes, the data speaks for itself, but we still have a ways to go in terms of really understanding everything there is to know about body worn cameras and the effect of on officers as well as the public perceptions. So thank
Yeah.
you for sharing all of that. And speaking of courtrooms in the courts, which you touched on, so I know with our on blueline.ca, you've just published a piece with us that summarizes your research with Kelly Burke and Betty Bottoms,
Yeah.
Bet Bottoms, sorry, focused on jurors' perceptions of cases involving body-worn camera evidence. So, what was the main goal behind this specific research?
Yeah, and this is a really different type of research project. So, something I'm very interested in is partnering with police services, working actively with them to assess outcomes in the field. This is something that we consider a lab experiment. It's more artificial, it's more removed, but sometimes it's the only way we know how to start answering a question. The main question we're asking here is, when jurors are exposed to body worn camera footage, does it affect the decisions that they make? And it's more focused than that. We were specifically looking at a case that involved controversial officer use of force. And, you know, we got essentially a 50-50 decision on whether this officer's use of force was acceptable or not. That's the type of thing that you want. You want people to be on the fence, and now you want to see, well, when I show you the footage versus when I don't show you the footage, does it impact your opinion as a juror? And so in this study, what we had was people who agreed to volunteer to imagine that they're jurors, and we run them through this, what we call a mock trial study, where, you know, they are exposed to, they read and view these materials that say, you know, imagine that you're a juror, this is what you're seeing, here's this case that's happening. And we keep everything really consistent, except that we are manipulating, so varying whether people saw body-worn camera footage or whether they simply heard testimony about the footage. That was the really fundamental goal of what we were manipulating there. There's a little bit more to it, but fundamentally, if you see the footage versus if you don't, does it impact the perceptions you have about the people in the trial, like the officer and the defendant, and ultimately, does it impact your verdict? And what we found is that people who watched the body-worn camera video had more negative opinions of the officer. They thought that he was less credible, and they thought that his use of force was less justifiable. They were also more likely to find the defendant not guilty of resisting arrest. So there's something interesting going on there. And I'm not saying that this carries over if we see an officer doing a great job on a body-worn camera video, not to suggest that showing people body-worn camera footage reduces jurors' positivity to officers or enhances their likelihood to, you know, find a defendant not guilty of something. That's not it. It's in this particular situation when we see controversial use of force, seeing the video versus hearing about it are two different things, and it has an impact on jurors' decisions, as we demonstrated in this study. It is something that we need to understand more fully. There's very little research on that topic, but it is just an example of the sort of many ways that researchers can creatively think about building a body of knowledge that's relevant for practitioners to get a sense of, when it's really hard to be able to do that sort of study out in the field. You know, you kind of need to make these more artificial contexts to test a question like that.
Well, that's extremely fascinating. And anyone who wants to read that full article, you can find it online. I'll make sure to link to it at the bottom of where you're watching this video. So, recent unfortunate police involved deaths of citizens in the USA and Canada, it's seen a reignited media interest in body worn cameras, as you and I have discussed. So, what are the challenges currently to Canadian police adopting body worn cameras? And in your opinion, how do we overcome those challenges?
So it's really an issue of perspective, because there is certainly a contingent that doesn't necessarily want body worn cameras. So I don't know that always we would think about this as challenges that need to be overcome. Sometimes they're just challenges that exist and we want to properly identify them. So from a practitioner perspective, probably the biggest issue in reality is cost. These are fairly expensive pieces of technology and all of the associated use costs. For these reasons, understanding the effects and if they offset, what sort of effects are most important? Is the public demand, the effects on public opinions, does that offset the cost? That's something that is really a subjective decision that individual services need to decide, or perhaps Canada as a whole needs to decide. But it is, I'd say, one of the biggest true impediments to whether body-worn cameras get adopted or not. There is also this more general opposition that is something that needs to be considered. So users of the technology do express concerns. I'm talking about police here. Some police are concerned about police use of body-worn cameras for very valid privacy issues. And there are segments of the public that are concerned about the impact of this technology, particularly on privacy. And in a more general sense, really it's an issue of the expansion of police data collection. At what point do we cross the line at which it is not policing for people, it's policing of people? And a scholar that I have a particular affinity for, David Lyon, likes to say that about surveillance. Surveillance should be for people rather than of people. And this is a question that we fundamentally need to think about when it comes to body-worn cameras. I would say if body-worn cameras move forward, if we're thinking on that line, that the assumption is they do become a central part of Canadian policing, that for me the most pressing concern at the moment is that we need to get a handle on what body-worn camera policy is going to look like. So Canadian policing can and should be very proud of the fact that it is much more consistent across the country than what the US policing experience is. And policing, in my opinion, should be highly consistent across the country. That doesn't mean it can't be flexible and officers can't exercise discretion, but that if I have an experience with an officer in Nova Scotia versus British Columbia or elsewhere in Canada, my experience is relatively consistent in terms of the expectations and how it's going to go. Now, the present approach to body-worn cameras is that individual services are completely left to develop their own BWC policies, their internal directives. And that is something that is a very resource-intensive process for services. It is also a situation that sets up the proliferation of highly variable policies that will end up with policies across Canada that make decisions that are different from one another. And what that really does is put police, I think, in a fairly risky position. And it has to do with liability. Why is this service doing that and that service is doing something else? That's something that's not, I think, in the best interest of police and not in the best interest of the public either. To be able to have uniformity on key decisions, I think, is important here. So we can imagine that when we think about a body-worn camera policy for police, that there should be some percentage of that policy that should basically be able to be consistent across Canada. Let's imagine it was 60% of any policy should be the same regardless of what service you're operating at. And I'm talking about issues of things like when users are expected to activate their body-worn camera, whether they're expected to notify others that a body-worn camera is in use, whether they're allowed to view their footage before writing notes. So all of these details that we probably could get some general consistency on across the country. And the Canadian policing community, I think, can really benefit from a guideline like that. We have a couple things that are on that track in Canada. So BC has the closest thing. They've got a policing standard that relates to body-worn cameras that they produced in 2019, and it outlines for services in BC, if you're using cameras, these are the things you have to do. it still leaves open a lot of options for, what's not a requirement, which again, I think produces a lot of variability. Then we've also got the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and it's something very different, but they created recommendations related, of course, to privacy concerns and the importance of conducting privacy impact assessments. Now, those are great starting points, but I think we really need to see the production of a more comprehensive resource that can assist our policing community in using body-worn cameras in a consistent way across Canada.
Wonderful. I'm so glad you brought that up about the policy barrier. It's a discussion I have time and time again about, continually breaking down silos from agency to agency and looking
Yeah,
for standardizations, right? Even the last, I think, discussion we had was, why don't we have one way that we're all using the cloud so we all know how to use it and we're all using it the same way? So similar here with this technology. So thanks for
absolutely.
sharing that. So, on that note, I guess, how can researchers like yourself assist police in building an evidence-based understanding of body-worn cameras?
I'll keep it really short and sweet on this one. We, researchers, we can partner with police services. There is some opposition to that opinion. Myself and a number of other Canadian policing scholars disagree with the idea that researchers shouldn't partner with police. I think that it's incredibly important for researchers to partner with police services to provide expertise on research and then build evidence bases that are intended to be used by practitioners. So researchers need the partnership of practitioners to really enact change. I don't think that we can just assume that conducting research without police is going to be all that meaningful to the persons we're expecting to pay attention to the research that we do. And then on the other hand, I'd like to say that I think that practitioners also get value from working with researchers as well, that there's an expertise that we can bring that's intended to be removed from the internal workings of a service, that's intended to be neutral, that's intended to be objective, and that's intended to be helpful ultimately.
Couldn't agree more myself. So I'm curious, what are you working on now, and what can we expect to see from you next?
Well, I'm very excited to be partnering with the Guelph Police Service to assist them in evaluating their body-worn cameras pilot project. We are building on some of the work that I started with Durham in terms of really getting a stronger sense of especially victims' concerns related to body-worn cameras. Good grief, I don't know if you can hear this vehicle going by. So building that evidence base, being able to develop victim sensitive policy is something that I think is really important. Being able to continue to understand in a wider variety of contexts how using a camera affects public perceptions of an interaction. So those are things I'm really excited about with that project. But coming back to the idea of a policy template, so the national survey that I conducted with services over the last year invited services who had completed a body-worn camera policy to share it with me to be able to do a content analysis, so look at those policies and look for the consistencies and differences in them. And that, in combination with a wide variety of relevant material, including reports and inquests that have been conducted in Canada that call for body-worn cameras, our judicial case law that's developing that references body-worn cameras, all of that brought together with the academic research is something that I'm just getting ready to share with our policing community in the form of a template. And again, it's not something that I expect police services to have to use. It's a resource that I hope that they'll be interested in. So fortunately, both the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police have demonstrated an interest in that project, and we've been in discussions about how to continue to develop that policy template in a way that works best for practitioners. So I'm very excited about that project and hope I'll be sharing it with you very soon.
Yes, yeah, we are definitely going to be watching for that. So keep us up to date. That's fantastic news, and it's so needed. So thank you for everything you're doing for Canadian police and police worldwide, really.
Thank you.
Alana, thank you for your time today and sharing the body worn camera research and the ins and outs of the technology and the considerations for police officers near and far. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Always happy to be here, Renee. Bye bye.
It's a lady at 46 South Road.